Picking up where we left off on Chapter 2 of The Secret Team, the CIA and its allies in control of the United States and the world by Fletcher Prouty. At Puerto Cabezas in Nicaragua, the CIA gathered all the clandestine aircraft and considerable quantities of supplies and ammunition to support the invasion. Many of these aircraft were lost to Castro's jets, but vast amounts of equipment and some of the planes remained. With the collapse of the invasion, the material was unused. The U.S. pilots returned to Florida with a few planes. Later, the CIA asked the Army and Air Force mission personnel in Nicaragua to gather up and return all of this equipment. These officers were told by the Nicaraguans very politely and firmly that there was not a thing left at Puerto Cabezas, since it was all black cargo, it was stateless, and it was titleless. The United States never got any of it back, and this was only a fraction of the loss. All Latin American countries keep a very close eye on the I've never seen this word before. My God, I read a lot too. What the fuck? Apportionment. Apportionment. I would look it up if my phone wasn't in use right now, but I got a page 42. Apportionment. Apportionment. Apportionment? Latin American countries keep a very close eye on the apportionment of U.S. military aircraft, ships, and other material made available to other Latin American states. This formula for the balance of forces is very complex, and this arrangement is a most delicate issue. Other nations soon observed that Nicaragua had been given a large force supplement of B-26s and C-46s. The B-26s were specially modified and carried much more firepower per aircraft than those that had been given to other Latin American nations. The other military supplies, guns, rockets, and mountains of ammunition were also noted. The Nicaraguan government would not reveal how it obtained this unscheduled largesse, and the U.S. government could not. The other government's guessed, and no doubt knew, but they too played the game. They just keep the pressure on. Needless to say, the U.S. government had to make similar equipment available to a number of Latin American countries. The cost of all this, plus the logistics support of this equipment factors that should be added to the total cost of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Again, because of secrecy from Americans, not from the enemy, these facts have remained undeclared, along with so many others over the years. Early in 1960, President Eisenhower had authorized the secret training and arming of Cuban exiles in the United States. Thousands of able-bodied Cubans had fled their homeland, and many of them were dedicated to fighting their way back in and throwing Castro out. Eisenhower's approval was very general and nonspecific. It in no way contemplated anything like the invasion. It was understood that any special operation which would involve Cuba, planned at any time, would have to be cleared by the DCI. What did Department of Coordinated Intelligence. It was understood that any special operation which would involve Cuba, planned at any time, would have to be cleared by the Department of Counterintelligence in accordance with existing directives. This meant presenting the operation to Special Group 5412/2 In what appeared to the Department of Defense as a separate and certainly inconspicuous action, the CIA began to utilize a portion of Fort Gulick, a deactivated U.S. Army base in Panama. Gradually, a group of Cubans identified in Panama only as Latin American trainees in a military assistance program, MAP, began to increase in size and activity. The CIA soon found that this burgeoning camp needed military doctors. In accordance with an agreement between the CIA and the Department of Defense, the agency asked the Army for 3 doctors. At that time, the Army had a shortage of doctors, so it turned down the request for support from the CIA. Then the Navy was asked. It too turned down the request on the basis that Navy doctors on an Army post would be conspicuous and would not fit into the cover story. The CIA did not need flight surgeons, so it did not ask the Air Force for doctors. With these refusals in hand, the CIA made a direct appeal to the Office of the Secretary of Defense and won support for its request. This was the very first covert action in a long chain of events that ended in the invasion of the beach at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961. At the time of the request for these doctors, no one anywhere in the government of the United States ever dreamed that the little mound that was being built would ever become the mountainous disaster. Okay, another word I've yet to have read. Beginning the sentence over. At the time the request for these doctors, no one anywhere in the government of the United States ever dreamed that the little mound that was being built would ever become that mountainous disaster which finally resulted. It is characteristic to note that the CIA's request was honored and then directed from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. At that top echelon office of Special Operations acted as the liaison between the CIA and the Department of Defense. What most people in defense were totally unaware of was that in the very people... Wait a minute. What most people in defense were totally unaware of was that in the very office that was supposed to serve the military departments and shield them from promiscuous requests, there were concealed and harbored some of the most effective agents the CIA had ever had. Their approval of CIA requests was assured. The amazing fact was that their cover was so good that they could turn right around and write others directing the service concerned to comply with the request. There may have been some mention of the end use of these doctors for the Cuban training program, but if there was any mention, it would have meant little or nothing to those who had not been briefed. The Secretary of Defense and the Chairman heard more such requests during the next 12 months, but the complexities of the veil of secrecy woven by the secret team around the project was such that no one ever saw the whole plan. The use of the control device of need-to-know classification made this possible. As this control is generally practiced, the CIA accepts that a group of men have the clearances after a very thorough review by its own resources and, as requested, those of the FBI. Always, in the case of CIA works, this clearance begins at the top secret level. Beyond this, men are cleared for individual areas of information. A man may have a top secret clearance and a north side clearance, meaning that he may be given both classifications of information. However, those in control of north side, here's a footnote here, a hypothetical name in this instance. Such code names are given in great numbers to all operations and even to various phases or segments of classified operations. Okay. Beyond this, men are cleared for individual areas of information. A man may have a top secret clearance and a north side clearance, meaning that he may be giving both classifications of information. However, those in the control of north side may decide arbitrarily that certain men may not have some of the information even though they have the necessary clearance. The control team simply states that those men do not have a need to know, and from that time on, unless they are reinstated, they are excluded from all or part of the project. There are, of course, some sensible and reasonable reasons for such practices, but that is not what is important here. The fact is that this exclusionary process is used as a tool arbitrarily. One way to make sure that there is little opposition to a proposed activity is to exclude possible opponents on the basis of lack of need to know. Thus, even though men are in high-ranking, policy-making jobs have the appropriate top secret and other special clearances, they may be kept in the dark about secret team plans, and they will never know it, at least not for a while. Thus, Adlai Stevenson, ambassador to the United Nations at the time of the Bay of Pigs, was not informed about the projected plans until the very last minute, when rumors and news releases appearing in the New York Times were being spread everywhere. Even then, Tracy Barnes, the CIA man sent to brief Stevenson, gave a vague and incomplete picture of the operation. The CIA could, if pressed, proved that the Office of Office of Strategic Defense. Okay, that's what it is. The CIA could, if pressed, prove that the Office of Secret Defense or Special Defense. One of those. The CIA could, if pressed, prove that the Office of Special Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff had been briefed almost daily from early 1960 until the very day of the invasion. But in spite of this, the bit-by-bit briefing, it was not until just before Kennedy's inauguration in late January 1961 that the Joint Chiefs of Staff got any kind of reasonably thorough briefing. By that time, it was much too late. The secret team had strong-armed the early Eisenhower authorization of the training and arming of Cubans into an invasion of a foreign country during the lame duck period of his administration. Need-to-know control can be bent in the other direction in order to secure the support of potential allies and further those allies' careers. Members of the team who strongly favored the election of John F. Kennedy over Richard Nixon played a very special role in the 1960 election campaign. Nixon presided over the National Security Council and therefore knew in detail the plans that were intended to have been carried out under the earlier Eisenhower authorization. For one thing, he knew that such authorization did not include anything like the invasion of a foreign country. At the same time, it was assumed that Senator Kennedy, as an outsider, did not know those highly classified details. However, he did know. In his book, Six Crises, Nixon wrote that Kennedy was told about the invasion by Allen Dulles during the traditional CIA briefing for candidates. But there was more than that to the story, too, it appears. A former staff member from the Office of Strategic Defense, recollects that during the summer of 1960, he was sent to the Senate office building to pick up an escort to the Pentagon for Cuban exile leaders, among them one of the future commanders of the Bay of Pigs invasion forces who had been meeting with the then Senator Kennedy. Those men, Manuel Artime, Huesos, Jose Miro Cardona, the first premier of Cuba under Castro, Manuel Antonio de Varona, former president of Cuba before Batista regime, and the fourth man, who may have been Arellano Sanchez Arango, former foreign minister of Cuba, were all supposed to be under special security wraps. They certainly were not expected to be exposed to members of Congress, least of all to the senator who was close to being nominated as the Democratic flag bearer. However, certain CIA officials had introduced them to Kennedy, thus making sure that he knew as much about the plans they were contemplating as did Nixon. In fact, Kennedy may have learned more than Nixon as the result of this personal meeting, an opportunity Nixon did not have, with the Cuban Refugee Front and with its American secret sponsors. Throughout this period in 1960, Eisenhower had directed that the Cuban exiles' training and arming to be kept at a low level. He felt that he should not bequeath to the incoming administration, whether Republican or Democrat, any such clandestine operations, small as they were under the limited proposal which he had approved. As a result, any plans for expansion of Cuban activities were made to appear by the secret team to the Cubans alone. The CIA carefully saw to it that the Cubans had the means to travel to and visit such activists' headquarters as the American Legion Convention and other avowedly anti-Castro strongholds. As the political campaign picked up momentum, so did the Cuban exiles' activities, with John Kennedy playing a strong, quiet role on their behalf. His support further endeared him to the CIA because the anti-Castro project was their biggest special operation at that time, since the Tibetan and Laotian projects had begun to wane. When the candidates appeared on television together during the crucial campaign debates, Nixon, abiding by security restrictions, which in his case he could not disavow even if he had wished to, limited himself in his discussions to the government's plans for Cuba. This official control did not publicly apply to Kennedy. Since he had been briefed by Allen Dulles, he could have been warned about security violations, but the CIA can be quite liberal with respect to security when it is to that agency's advantage. As a result, Kennedy could and did openly advocate to overthrow the Castro government, and for the strong position he won popular support from a great number of the voters. Nixon's frustration and anger at Nixon's frustrated and anger at Kennedy's calculated tactics were clearly evident on the television screen, as television audiences have learned in the years since those famous debates. When Nixon feels frustration and anger on television, he shows it. And when he felt both during the Kennedy debates, the audience knew it, and Kennedy made points. Many observers believed that confrontation over Cuba was one of the peak moments during the debates, when Kennedy scored most heavily, and of course most observers credit Kennedy's performance during the debates with his narrow margin of victory in the election. Few knew that his carefree television position on Cuba was in reality Nixon's official stand in the security-bound National Security Council record. That Kennedy's connection with the Cuban refugees before his election was anything but casual or fortuitous, with demonstrated nearly 2 years later. On December 29, 1962, in the Orange Bowl in Miami, before the national television audience, at a welcome back celebration for the ransomed prisoners of the Cuban Brigade, before a thundering ovation from the jammed stadium, the president spoke informally with the brigade and with the tens of thousands of Cubans who came to pack the stadium. At one point during the ceremonies, the president walked among the former prisoners, chatted with them, and then drew his arm over the shoulders of one of them. If those watching in the stadium and on TV thought he had chosen this man at random, they weren't mistaken. The Cuban he embraced was his old friend who had visited him in his Senate offices during the summer of 1960 and also at his West Palm Beach home. This man was Manuel Aretime, the leader of the invasion. One of the most significant aspects of secret team work is its control of operational planning by need-to-know secrecy. And as we stated earlier, such control seriously limits the level of competency that can be brought to a major operation such as the Bay of Pigs. The CIA never really knew what to do about Castro and Cuba. During the latter days of 1958, the CIA assembled a staff of Cuban experts under the leadership of its old Western Hemisphere division hands such as Colonel J.C. King. But the real inside men, those who had responsible roles in these operations and in their so-called planning, are never discovered. The first somewhat obvious reason usually given is that, of course, those names would not show up because the agency very wisely kept them concealed under proper security. This may be part of the answer, but it is more probable that they would have been linked with the exercise for two other reasons. First, they were truly faceless and practically meaningless participants in the action. They were in their jobs simply to see that things rolled along. Second, because once such an operation has been briefed to the National Security Council and the lower middle level of the agency's operations and support staff know that the green light is on, they begin to move in all directions, and from that time on there is a very little real leadership. Money becomes obtainable, equipment is made available, travel is abundant, the horn of plenty spills over, and all is hidden in secrecy, partially by plan, but mostly by the simple fact that no one at the top restrains the action of these activities at the lower levels. Everything begins to happen everywhere at the same time. There is a special sort of Murphy's Law about clandestine activities once they have received an initial and very general approval. If anything can happen, it will. The U.S. government is simply not constituted to become aware of and to control such faceless and random activities as those that take place under the shield of secrecy once the game has been discovered and perfected by the often amorphous secret team. Nothing demonstrates this better than the single bitter underlying reason for the failure of the Bay of Pigs operation. The Bay of Pigs effort failed for the lack of effective leadership, and for no other reason. It could have worked and it could have succeeded. Everything was there that had to be there. The goals were not so grand that they could not have been achieved. To maintain an invasion force on Cuban territory for at least 72 hours, and then to proclaim the free government of Cuba there on that bit of territory. After that, it would have been up to the Organization of the American States and the United States to support them. But the Bay of Pigs operation did not have leadership when it was most needed. Allen Dulles, the man at the helm, was not even in Washington. Perhaps he thought the invasion could run by itself. For whatever reason he had in mind, Allen Dulles was not even in the United States at the time of these crucial landings. That guy was an undercover communist, you know? That guy's a spy master supreme. He didn't just lackadaisically, that was planned. As poorly planned as this over-the-bench operations was, it could have been a success within the original parameters of the effort. Jose Miro Cardona had been told that when the invasion forces had been on Cuban soil for 72 hours, had raised the free Cuba flag on Cuban soil, and had proclaimed themselves to be the new government, he would be delivered to the beachhead. Then, when he appeared for assistance from the Organization of American States, the United States would give his government of free Cuba the assistance it needed. It was expected that once such a government had been established, albeit on the flimsiest grounds, Cubans would flock to its support, and that once U.S. government assistance was visible and real, such as U.S. warships off the coast, U.S. aircraft flying unopposed all over Cuba, and even U.S. Marines at the beachhead, then the decay of Castro's Cuba would be certain. In essence, this is what the Cubans believed. It may have been... lost my place. It may have been what the CIA had in mind, and as it got caught up in the fervor of the training and arming authorized by President Eisenhower. However, no one could say that Eisenhower, the tough and experienced commanding general of the greatest invasion force of all time, had ever suggested or approved the invasion of Cuba clandestinely with a force of less than 2,000 Cuban exiles. Whatever the Cuban project had grown to in the hands of the CIA took place after the election day in 1960. The leadership on the beach was competent enough for the job at hand. The Cubans themselves were good. The tactical leadership back in Nicaragua, both for the invasion and for the small airstrike, was adequate. The substratum of U.S. military personnel attached to the CIA to bring some order out of the training program was competent, especially the U.S. Maritime Corps colonel who worked so hard and effectively to see the little band of Cubans had some idea of what to do when they hit the beach. The U.S. Air Force officers attached to the CIA, who pulled together the small, hard-hitting Air Force of World War II B-26s and C-46s, were skilled and combat qualified, but above them leadership was practically non-existent. The proper official would have approved of the Bay of Pigs operation No proper official would have approved of the Bay of Pigs operation unless there was a guarantee that Castro would not have been able to give up any effective air opposition. The few close-in, hardcore officers who knew the real plan would never have given any support to the plan if they did not have assurances that Allen Dulles would be able to guarantee that Castro's few combat-ready aircraft would have been bombed out of existence before the men hit the beach. This was the fundament upon which the operation was established. It was its failure that sealed its doom. Before the first Cuban exiles B-26 attack on Castro's aircraft, YouTube pictures detailed exactly where Fidel's planes were and how many there were. The first wave of B-26s hit those planes and destroyed them, and with exception of the three T-33 jet trainers, two B-26s, and a few old British Sea Furies. In modern air weapons systems technology, the T-33 is a very low-order combat aircraft, and actually it has very little combat capability. However, it is a big jump better than the B-26 bomber in air-to-air combat. Therefore, until these three T-33s had been located and destroyed, there was to be no invasion. The B-26s and the Sea Furies could be handled and ignored. Castro's B-26s were not nearly as effective as the newly modified ones of the Cuban exiles. It had just happened that the three T-33 jets had been flown to a small airfield outside the Havana area for the weekend. The chance removal of these planes saved them from the first attack. The Bay of Pigs instructions called for additional airstrikes to get all of Castro's planes if this was not accomplished by the first strikes. This prerequisite was simple and necessary. Damage assessment photos not only showed that the T-33s had escaped, but they showed where they were, lined up on an airfield. Wait a minute. Damn, I lost my place. Damage assessment photos not only showed that the T-33s had escaped, but they showed where they were, lined up on an airfield near Santiago. With this knowledge, a flight of B-26s at Puerto Cabezas in Nicaragua was loaded with bombs and fueled for the long flight to the target. These were excellent B-26s, which had been modified by the CIA to have a cluster of 850 caliber machine guns firing from the nose. This gun pack is most lethal and unsurprised for the type of operation contemplated. The guns could have made mincemeat of Castro's T-33s on the ground. In the air, the T-33 would have chopped them up. Thus the plan was for these planes to leave Puerto Cabezas at an early hour to assure undetected arrival at the target at sunrise and to permit them to sweep in over the airfield with the sun low and at their backs to give them much ground fire protection as they could get. As late as 1:30 in the morning, the CIA agent who was in charge of these planes in Nicaragua had not received the expected message from Washington that would authorize their takeoff. Later, acting on his own initiative and to keep the excited, ready-to-go Cubans quiet, he permitted them to start their engines on condition that they wait for his signal for takeoff. Meanwhile, in Washington, heated arguments had arisen over the first airstrikes. There was so much opposition to the second strike that those who sought the authority to release these planes were unable to gain approval. On the one hand, General Cabell, the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, and Richard Bissell, the Deputy Director of Plans, and the man who was responsible for the entire operation, were second-level officials. They were unable to release the planes on their own authority, and they were opposed by others. some of whom were of cabinet level. It became a question of who would awaken the president at his Glen or retreat in Virginia in an attempt to get his approval. Neither Cable nor Bissell had the authority to do that, and Allen Dulles was not in Washington at this crucial time when his agency was faced with its most monumentous crisis, a crisis of leadership. Dulles had left Washington to go to Puerto Rico to address the convention of the young president's organization. He was the man who could have given permission for the planes to go, or who could have gone to the president himself for that authority. On that fateful night, the CIA was leaderless. The opposition stood its ground, and the airstrike was not ordered to attack the jets at Santiago. This was key to the failure of the whole operation. Those 3 jets destroyed no less than 10 B-26s along with some ground equipment and sank the vital supply ship offshore. Perhaps if one CIA agent had taken a short bicycle ride, the whole invasion could have been a success. The Cuban pilots in those B-26s on the ground at Puerto Cabezas with their engines running were on the point of mutiny. They were going to go without word from Washington, except for one thing. The agent who had the sole authority there to release them had told them that Washington was making a last-minute check of the target photographs and that they had better wait until he got the word. They half believed him. Later, his own faith in the system wavered badly, and he knew that as the moments ticked away, the last chance the B-26s would have to get to the target airfield before sunrise would be gone. After that, Castro's jets could be expected to be gone. Nearby, the agent had a bicycle that he used for his trips back and forth to the operations shack where the circuit to Washington was. During those last few moments, he looked at that bicycle, certain that if he got on it and rode away toward the shack, the Cubans would go without waiting for his signal. The temptation was great. He had worked with some of those Cubans for 2 years. He knew how badly they wanted the operation to succeed, but his own discipline was stronger. He did not take that ride. Finally, it was too late. The crews shut down the engines and got out of the planes. Far across the Caribbean, the small invasion fleet approached the shore secure in the belief that Castro's planes had been destroyed. They hit the beach shortly after sunrise, and it wasn't long before they came under heavy air attack. They knew then that their time was limited, and to this tragedy, the same B-26s that were to have wiped out the jets were ordered over the beach to give the invasion troops some firepower against ground opposition. The B-26s were shot down by those jets which only a few hours earlier could have been destroyed. And in sunny Puerto Rico, the Department of Counterintelligence entered a convention hall to give a speech to a group of young businessmen. This was the kind of elite group he liked. He was at his best among them, and he enlisted their support on behalf of the agency, which was saving the world from communism, right? And many of those same men have since traveled throughout the world on matters concerning business, wearing around their necks the mark of the agency, the shoulder strap of a new camera. These same men eagerly went from country to country as special agents for the CIA. But when the chips were down and those brave Cubans had been landed on the beach by the CIA, Allen Dulles was not there. He was perhaps the one man in Washington. He had been there. I'm reading that over. But when the chips were down and those brave Cubans had been landed on the beach by the CIA, Allen Dulles was not there. He was perhaps the one man in Washington. Had he been there, who could have sent those bombers out that morning for the purpose of destroying Castro's jets? The Bay of Pigs operation serves as an excellent example of what is good and what is bad about clandestine operations, and about the same way they are developed, supported, and managed by the secret team. From the first assistance to the first small group of Cubans in Miami, from the first light plane touchdown on a remote road in Cuba to exfiltrate one of the two men, to the huge operation involving thousands of men and tens of millions of dollars worth of equipment, to the tragic failure on the beach and the imprisonment of an eventual payment of ransom tribute to Castro, the Bay of Pigs operation was nothing but a somewhat related series of escalating events, which, simply stated, just got out of hand after the election of John F. Kennedy. Some peripheral incidents that have not been apparent are worth a word. After Castro took over Cuba, he nationalized industry and kicked all Americans out of the country. Those companies that had been doing business in Cuba suffered heavy losses. Among the worst of these losses were those felt by the sugar companies. The stock of some of these firms traded at very low rates, if it could be traded at all. With the Cuban support program moving into a higher gear after the election of Kennedy, was a large number of CIA personnel made heavy purchases of these deflated stocks, and word spread to some of their friends that a flyer in sugar stock might be worth the gamble. So orders to buy sugar stock went out all over the country. The stockbroker community in Washington is most sophisticated. Over the years, they see a lot of inside buying for reasons they have no way of knowing. In an attempt to ferret out some of these details, they have developed their own expertise in divining what's going on. When the sugar purchases were at their peak, some of these brokers called their sources in the Pentagon on the assumption that if something was going to happen in Cuba, the military would know about it. Of course, very few military knew about the invasion, and those who did would not have the temerity to let anyone know. Most of all, a broker. So the brokers were not getting much help in the usual channels. However, one broker happened to hit an idea, called a certain mutual fund group where he had reason to believe that there was some more. One broker who happened to hit on an idea called a certain mutual fund group where he had reason to believe that there was some more than routine contact with the secret areas in the government. He was able to learn that they had been buying a little sugar stock. He put two and two together and inadvertently started a small buying spree among his and his company's clients. Needless to say, the sugar balloon burst in those beaches in Cuba. But there have been many other times when the very special inside group, but there have been many other times when the very special inside scoop the secret team is able to control has led to some very good investments. More will be said about this as more is learned about the early days of the Indochina affairs during the past 10 years. It does not take anyone long to become an avid secret team booster. Once he has slipped the elixir of certain and easy money derived from an inside tip on a sure thing. And that's it for chapter 2. We will be in part 2, the CIA, how it runs, tomorrow. Until next time.